Good evening, and welcome to the Bangalore International Center for this lecture by Professor Vidya Dehejia, The Thief Who Stole My Heart, Sacred Bronzes from Chola, India. Professor Dehejia had spoken online for us in a session in 2021, and we've been wanting to have her in person at the BIC for a number of years, so we're grateful the day has finally come. Having admired her work as a young graduate student and followed it over the years, it gives me great pleasure to be introducing her today. Professor Vidya Dehejia is Barbara Stoller Miller Professor Emerita of Indian Art at Columbia University, New York. She's taught undergraduate and graduate courses and has guided doctoral students on South Asian art from the early Buddhist period, her early work, all the way to British colonial art. Her two-part course on the temple architecture of India was a sort of rite of passage for art history majors interested in South Asia at Columbia. And over the past 45 years, she's combined research with teaching and exhibition-related activities around the world. She's done extensive fieldwork in South Asia, with visits to sites of importance in Southeast Asia as well, gaining familiarity with the art of that region. She's explored at length the theoretical basis for the portrayal of visual narratives in the context of India's sculpture and painting, and examined gender and colonialism issues in this work. This interest in narrative and literature is, of course, reflected in today's title, but is really throughout her work. Her background in classical Sanskrit and Tamil, her knowledge of several modern Indian languages, and her translations of ancient Tamil poetry give her work a literary flair and poetic color, as we see in the title, which is derived from the child saint Sambandar's opening hymn that hails Lord Shiva as the thief who stole my heart. She told me once that she reads one book a week outside all her scholarly work and reading. And she tells me just now that sometimes it's more than a book a week, which I was quite amazed by. Over the years, her work has ranged from Buddhist art of the centuries BC to the esoteric temples of North India, and from the sacred bronzes of South India to art under the British Raj. Dr. Dehejia also has management and curatorial experience at the Smithsonian's Freer and Sackler galleries, providing a broad mandate to cover the excitement of the field of South Asian art to non-specialist students. Her book on Indian art, which is a kind of overview, and I've recommended it to many travelers to India as an introduction to not only Indian art, but also Indian history and culture. I have distinct memories of the brilliant exhibitions on art from the Indian subcontinent that she curated at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. in the 90s. I remember she kindly allowed me, in the middle of this really big exhibition on Devi, the great goddess, she allowed me to interview her as a young person at the time. And I think mentoring and kindness to young scholars has been very much part of her work. Among her many awards is a Padma Bhushan from the Government of India. Professor Dehejia has published 27 books and over 35 scholarly articles. Her latest book, based on a 6-part Mellon lecture series that she was invited to give, was published by Princeton University Press in 2021, and she will be sharing insights from the book today. A detailed biography is on the BIC website. Please check to see that your mobile phones are switched off or turned on silent mode. And without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Dehejia on stage.
Pratiti. That was some introduction. Thank you. It was overwhelming. I'm sitting there and sort of wondering, what is she going to say next? Okay, so if I can get, yes, okay. The thief who stole my heart the cover of which you see on the screen right now, is a much expanded version of the 65th A.W. Mellon lectures that I was invited to give in Washington, D.C., and that Pratiti just mentioned. It was the 65th of these lectures in the fine arts, and it was the very first time in that 65-year history of the Mellon lectures that they thought of featuring India. I believe that the original lectures, there were a set of 6 lectures, are still available online, but the book itself is obviously a much expanded version of those lectures. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to present this material here in Bangalore. The Princeton University book is sort of available, but not at a price that one picks up readily. And I talked to them at length about co-publishing with an Indian publisher so that it would be more readily available. But they said, no, the Mellon lecture books are never co-published. So here we are with that. Okay. I'd like to start by introducing you to a master sculptor of the Chola period, one who is surely in the league of Michelangelo or Leonardo of Renaissance fame. So, will you travel back in time with me for a few brief moments to a little over 1,000 years ago? We would be at the small coastal village of Tiruvangadu along the Bay of Bengal, close to where the Kaveri River enters the ocean. It is dawn in the year 1010, and this master sculptor is stirring beeswax and the resin of the shal tree that is bubbling in a large pot. He's carefully preparing the mixture for the image he is going to model. And he thinks back to his conversation a few days prior with the commander of a military regiment of the great Chola monarch Rajaraja. And the commander had sought him out, cash in hand, to ask him to create a majestic bronze image of Shiva with a bull. Yes, thought the master sculptor, he would definitely make Shiva majestic, but he could not forget child saint Sambandar's hymn, praising Shiva as the thief who stole my heart. And the master resolved to make his image the ultimate heart stealer. This is the stunning image dedicated in the year 1011, one of his many masterpieces for the Tiruvangadu temple. Elegantly poised to rest his weight on his left foot, with his right foot bent at the knee, crossed in front, so as to lightly rest his toes on the ground, this glorious image is about 3.5 feet tall without all its pedestals. It's quite bewitching in its beauty. Shiva's left hand rests elegantly on his hip. His right arm is bent to place his elbow on his now missing bull. The firm tone of his lithe body gives him a commanding presence, while the hint of a smile parting his lush lips transforms him into an accessible figure whom the devotee may confidently approach. Our master has abandoned the usual mode of portraying Shiva with his jatas piled high on his head. Instead, he took the length of those jatas and wound them around his head to create the effect of almost an elegant turban, with just, if you can look carefully, the serpent's hood and the tip of the trumpet flower, the conray blossom, emerging above his locks. And then, of course, Shiva is the Lord who wears the moon in his jatas. Just look at the way in which the master has positioned that crescent moon while he is modeling in wax, so that it weaves over and under one of his jatas. His face, framed by this pattam, the forehead band, carries a serene contemplative look, The third eye adorns his forehead. He wears a large circular earring in one ear. The other ear remains unadorned. Broad-shouldered Shiva wears 3 necklaces, a sacred thread. His narrow torso is emphasized by that simple high waistband. His short lower garment, his veshti, is slung well below his navel and held in place with an elaborate jeweled belt with a lion head clasp. Completing his adornment is an elbow band, a wristband, anklets, rings on 8 fingers and 8 toes, with only the middle finger and the middle toe left without a ring. And notice his gently rounded fingernails. It's a signature touch of this master. It's unfortunate that we do not know the sculptor's name. We must refer to him only as the master of Tiruvangadu, the temple for which he produced many stunning bronzes. It's rare for Chola bronzes to be securely dated, but at Tiruvangadu we are fortunate in having several inscriptions on the base moldings and the walls of the temple that provide highly specific information about donors and their donations. None of these inscriptions have been translated in their entirety into English, and even a full Tamil version is not available in print or online. So you have to make a trip to the town of Mysuru, to the offices of the Epigraphical Survey of India, to get access either to the original rubbings that have been taken from the temple walls, or sometimes to a transcribed copy. In the case of our glorious Shiva, a partly damaged inscription dates to the year 1011. It remains sufficiently intact to inform us that this image of Shiva as the bull rider was set up by a military chief who belonged to the select warriors of a regiment known as Sri Rajaraja Jananatha, and both those, of course, are titles of the Chola king Rajaraja, who ruled from 985 to 1012. The donor, Kadamban Kolakavan, came from a town some 10 miles away. And the inscription tells us that he is making a gift of sacred ornaments to adorn the image he has just presented to the temple. And we may be sure that those jewels were extravagant, as we will see much later on. The companion image of Uma, who of course always accompanies Lord Shiva, stands in serene elegance just over 3 feet tall. Gracefully poised in Tribanga, her lovely oval face with its forehead band, that same pattam, is topped with a richly adorned tall conical crown, while at the rear of her head is that halo-like Shiras chakra, that circle of glory. Her long skirt is slung way below the navel, held in place with fabric bands, which end in a makara clasp. Her slender torso, with its gently rounded breasts, is adorned with 3 necklaces. A sacred thread snakes between her breasts, reaches way down to her hips. She wears elaborate armlets, a simple elbow band, a cluster of bangles, and rings on 8 fingers. The master's touch is visible in that distinctive treatment of the hands, the ringed fingers, and those gently rounded fingernails that are among his signature touches. An inscription dated to the year 1012 contains intriguing information about the joint donation of this copper image, Sheputirumeni, of goddess Uma, to accompany the image of Shiva as the Lord with the bull. A certain Lord Sarpan ensured that 11 other individuals contributed their share towards the expenses involved in commissioning the bronze of Uma, as well as the image of the bull, to accompany the Shiva bronze created the previous year by the military commander. The inscription is badly damaged along its central segment, but intact along its right side, where the word for and, it's not really and, it's ivarum avarum, that sort of a phrase, repeatedly occurs to punctuate the names themselves. So together, these 12 people commissioned the bronze of Uma and the now missing bull, without which, of course, the image of Shiva with his elbow poised to rest against the hump of the bull is incomplete. The superb mastery of this unnamed master of Tiruvangadu is seen also in a sensitive rendering of this four-piece bronze group that represents the divine marriage of Shiva and Uma. We see God Shiva taking the hand of his bride Uma in marriage, and to the right is God Vishnu, the major competing god of the Hindu pantheon. What is he doing here? Well, in South India, and South India alone, Vishnu is regarded as Uma's brother, and thus has a major role to play in his sister's wedding. And Vishnu's consort, Lakshmi, you see her to the far left, is portrayed here in the role of the bride's friend and confidant. The master has captured a tender, fleeting moment, giving us a confident and eager bridegroom with a shy, hesitant bride. This poised bridegroom reaches out confidently with his right hand and takes his bride's right hand in marriage. Note the way in which that master artist has positioned a very young, timid Uma to stand hesitantly a few steps behind the powerful bridegroom, with her shoulders curving inwards a trifle, as if to shield a vulnerable body. This is not the self-contained, confident consort who stands serenely composed beside Shiva with the bull. Here, instead, is an innocent, timid, bashful bride. And notice, too, how well the master artist has captured the hidden understanding of a sensitive moment by the bride's confidant. Lakshmi uses both her hands to gently urge this young bride to move towards Shiva. How extraordinary that this master artist should have bothered to capture this delicate moment. Together with the missing lotus base on which each image would have stood, and the rectangular pedestal on which they would then be further mounted, these images would have been about the same size as the Shiva and Uma we looked at, a little over 4 feet tall. When carried in procession through temple and town during the various festivals, their imposing grandeur would have struck wondrous reverence into their audience. I can't resist introducing you to just one more of the many magnificent images of Shiva from the hands of our master sculptor. Shiva, the begging lord, is a form truly beloved of Shiva devotees in Tamil Nadu. The exhilarating, sensitive treatment of Shiva as the naked beggar is profoundly haunting. The story you all know. Shiva wandered the Tamil country walking in wooden clogs from home to seek food in the bowl, skull bowl, that he holds in his left hand, accompanied by his pet antelope. The Nayanmar saints sang of the inexpressible radiance of this form of Shiva, whom they addressed simply as Pichadevar, begging lord. And they described how the women of every household were hopelessly enamored of him. Saint Sundarar in particular sang of the beauty of this paradoxical, eccentric form of Shiva, placing each verse in the lips of a woman who came to give him alms. Here is one such verse. What strange attire is this of yours? The music of the Tamil tongue adorns your speech, the while the serpent dances on your hand. We bring you food, but how to give it to you when your serpent hisses? Pray tell us, handsome one of the forests, does not the radiance of your form mock the glory of the setting sun? The saints use these conversational, intimate language as one may speak with a friend. When you come for Bali, we don't want your serpent. That's what they're saying. Baliki neer varumpodu, kaiyil paambu vendam piranire. It's understandable conversational language. Shiva's matted locks here are, his jatas are partially held back by this pattam, forehead pattam. You can see the tie bands to the right there, and the serpent emerges from the locks, as does the crescent moon on the other side and the trumpet flower, the conray blossom. And there are a few upswept locks. And if you look carefully, you see that there is a human skull that adorns those locks. Details were important to this master sculptor. I doubt that you can see it in this image, but the human skull that adorns his upswept jatas have inset silver eye sockets. Shiva's pet serpent wraps itself about his hips as if to serve as loincloth, but as Saint Sambandar playfully sang, the serpent has a mind of its own and fully reveals Shiva's form. It's fascinating to notice the details that the sculptor wished to portray. Do you see the forked tongue of the serpent? It's best seen at a slight angle and then only to the oh-so-close looker. The sensitive and delicate treatment of the fingers that curve in pliant gestures and those gently rounded fingernails, the hallmark of the Tiruvangadu master, and his magnificent handling of the tight buttocks of Shiva is quite entrancing. The Myanmars routinely use that conversational language that I just spoke about. Here, for instance, is a hymn by Saint Appar, in which one woman confides in her companion. Listen, my friend, yesterday in broad daylight, I'm sure I saw that Holy One. As he gazed at me, my garment slipped. I brought him food, but nowhere did I see that Holy One. If I see him again, I shall press my body against his body, never let him go, that wanderer in Utriyur. You know, in North India, erotic poetry is addressed to Krishna. In the Tamil country, it's this great, powerful god Shiva who is the recipient of love poetry. Take a look at this mini detail from 3 different bronzes, all created by our Tiruvangadu master. Look specifically to the treatment of those fingernails, beautifully shaped to extend in lightly rounded form just beyond the finger itself. They're unmistakable. Before we leave our master, let's take a look at the practical issue of affordability. Not all would-be donors had the wherewithal to commission an image from the Tiruvangadu master. We just saw that 12 persons combined their donations, you could call it a form of crowdsourcing, to create the image of Uma and of the bull. And yet devotional fervor demanded other images to be commissioned to enable the temple's expanded festival cycle. Such donors would have commissioned images from the master's apprentice, maybe his chief apprentice, who created bronzes in the same style, but they lack the pizzazz, the vitality, the spark of our master. Let's look at just one such commission. A threesome group featuring the god Subramanya, younger son of Shiva and Uma, with his 2 consorts. The god stands 36.5 inches high, as imposing in size as the master's Shiva with the bull, and his 2 consorts are proportioned accordingly. They are fine bronzes, following a scheme similar to that of the master. Yet, look at the exquisite hint of a smile on the face created by the master, and then look at the somewhat flabby jawline on the one modeled by his apprentice. And we might make a similar comment about the image of the two consorts. The work of the apprentice is remarkably good, but it just can't match the master's perfection. My book moves, however, beyond the sensuous, although I love to dwell on that part of it and the poetry, to ask questions of this material that have not been asked before. The bronzes are not merely exquisite masterpieces created by talented wax modelers and accomplished metal casters. They are material objects too, objects that interacted in meaningful ways with human activities and with socio-economic and religious practices. And in the rest of our time together, I'd like to give you a few glimpses of the material on which I have focused in my research. We all know that Chola bronzes are sacred images commissioned by temples for festival worship. A total of 311 temples were built in just the three districts of Trichy, Tanjavur, and Nagapattinam that form the heart of Chola territory along the lower reaches of the Kaveri River. On a conservative estimate, each temple housed at least 10 bronzes to fulfill its ritual cycle. And that would give us a total of over 3,000 sacred bronzes in just these three districts over the 4.5 centuries of Chola rule. You all know too that every Chola bronze is portable, intended to be carried in procession through temple and town during the festivals celebrated at each temple. The holes and the lugs, either on the lotus base or on the lower pedestals, were for the poles to be threaded through them to enable them being carried in procession by temple staff, by devotees. During the 6th and 7th century, when the Nayanmar saints and the Alvar saints sang the glories of Shiva and Vishnu, portable deities had become quite crucial to Tamil worship. The saints sang of Shiva going on his rounds amid the glitter of a pearl canopy, and they spoke of the splendor of the festival days. But there were no processional bronzes in the 7th century when these hymns were composed. Early festival images were likely created of wood. But around the year 855, as the Cholas came to the throne, a dramatic change occurred that involved the introduction of copper on a scale never before seen in Tamil Nadu. Now began the creation of what temple inscriptions describe as Sheppu Tirumeni, sacred forms of copper. Technical studies indicate that the images tend to have a copper content that varies between 90% and 95%, with the remaining 5 or 10% being comprised of quantities of tin and lead, often equal quantities. All Chola bronzes are solid bronzes, so that this image of dancing Shiva from the Cleveland Museum, it's just about 4 feet tall, including the Tiruvachi. It weighs 257 pounds. Chola bronzes are extremely heavy pieces of solid metal, bronzes from just about every other part of the world, whether it's the Mediterranean, Greece and Rome, or whether it's the Far East. They are all hollow, and thus far more economical in their use of metal. Now here's the extraordinary situation. In the course of field research for the Mellon lectures, I discovered that there is no copper in Tamil Nadu itself that may be easily extracted, cost-effectively extracted, and that no one has a clue regarding the source from which copper was obtained to create this multitude of Chola bronzes. Isn't it extraordinary that such an important issue has been overlooked by all of us, myself included, without so much as a second thought? How and where was copper produced in sufficient quantity to revolutionize the creation of processional images, and also the production of the many copper plate inscriptions issued by the Chola monarchs. The recently discovered Tiruvindallur copper plates of Emperor Rajadiraja of the year 1065 consists of 85 sheets of copper. Together with that ring with its seal, it weighs 330 pounds. And I worked out that 200 tons of copper would be required to create bronzes for Chola temples in just those 3 districts I mentioned, Trichy, Tanjavur, Nagapattinam, never mind anything further north. Forget Chidambaram, Gangakonda, Sholapuram, all those places. My probing revealed an unexpected and exciting possible source for Chola copper in neighboring Sri Lanka, thanks to the work of Arjun Tantilage and his Sri Lankan colleagues, all scholars of archaeology and metallurgy. The Seruvilla copper belt in northwestern Sri Lanka, south of the port of Trincomalee, I've tried to indicate it in a coppery color, is within easy access of the major city centers of Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa. It has yielded archaeological evidence of copper ore extraction on an industrial scale during the first millennium, the entire first millennium. Sri Lankan scholars are positive that the copper was exported, but they have no idea where it went. Is there anything special about Seruvilla copper? Yes, it has a clear, exceedingly rare trace element of cobalt nickel. It's a small trace element, but it's significant. With the help of the Freer lab, 3 of the 5 bronzes we tested showed high traces of cobalt nickel. However, it is necessary for the Seruvilla ore itself, extracted from the Sri Lankan mines, and the drillings from Chola bronzes to be tested in the very same lab under identical conditions with identical calibration. And that sounds like a difficult thing to achieve. So till then, my proposal that Seruvilla was one major source of copper for Chola bronzes must remain only a strong possibility. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence which I've detailed in the book, but it cannot be a proven fact until that sort of a testing is done. But there can be no doubt that the shift from wood to the large-scale creation of sizable copper sculptures indicates that a new and readily available source of copper ore had been identified by the Cholas. You're all familiar with Shiva as the wondrous dancer, even though it is an amazing concept, isn't it, to think of one's supreme deity as a master of dance. And it was Queen Shembian who popularized this form of Shiva and made his image an indispensable icon for the Tamil country. Some of you may wonder why I refer to this image here as the wondrous dancer. Why am I not using the better-known popular term Nataraja? I've not used the term Nataraja in my book at all, because the term was unknown during the Chola period. It was introduced into the Tamil country only during the 13th century, and that too by the Pandyan rulers of Madurai. And that, of course, was at a time when Chola rule was ending. Throughout Chola rule, dancing Shiva was addressed by a number of expressive Tamil names. And you may want to follow the English translations as I read the names in the original Tamil. Manikya Kuttar, Arahiya Kuttar, Kuttadum Devar, Kuttu Perumal, Kuttu Nayakar, Adavallan, Adal Vidanga Devar, Arbuda Kuttar, wondrous dances, is my favorite among these terms. And it was also the favorite of King Vikrama Chola, who ruled from 1118 to 1135. Okay, my intention here is not to speak about the Chola lost wax process. If anybody is interested, we can talk about it later. I show you these images to point out a couple of crucial issues. First, that the master creates his image in wax that you see on the upper left. It is then covered with clay. You see it in starting form, and here it is completely covered with clay, and it's baked, and the wax image melts, and it runs out through an aperture left in the base. Everybody knows that. But here's the point. The master's original image is gone. It's melted. Yes, it has left behind a baked clay mold. When molten metal is poured into it, it will in fact yield an exact replica of the master's wax image. But then, in order to reveal the metal image, that baked clay mold is smashed to smithereens. So neither the original wax image nor the original clay mold remains. Each Chola bronze in that sense is a singular piece. It cannot be replicated in any mechanical manner. And this is quite unlike Greek bronzes, Roman bronzes, Renaissance bronzes, Baroque bronzes, or the relatively modern Rodin bronzes, where the master's original is carefully preserved specifically for replication. And all the Greek and Roman texts talk about the fact that we've got these images, we are replicating them, and it's going to be on this place and that place and the other place. Not so with the Chola bronze. If a donor wants an image exactly like the one that the master made for a particular temple, he has to ask the Chola master, who will create another original in wax and go through the entire process again. It may be closely similar. It is, after all, the same master's hand at work, but it cannot be an exact replica, so that each Chola bronze is unique in that sense. What were the circumstances that permitted the creation of so many temples and such large numbers of exquisite bronzes, despite the constant warfare that the Chola monarchs undertook to retain their empire, to expand their empire? Inscriptions indicate the prime position held in Chola times by rice paddy. Rice was the measure by which wages were paid to temple employees. Rice was the measure by which goods were bought in the town markets. And it was the innovative irrigation system put in place by the Cholas that made possible the rich agricultural wealth that enabled donors to commission large numbers of bronze images and to further adorn them with lavish jewelry. More on jewels in a moment. If ever there was a monarchy that rose to power on the basis of irrigation and agriculture, it is the Cholas. The irrigation system they put in place, and that you are glimpsing here, it's not the river, remains to this day the mainstay of the prosperity of Tamil Nadu. That is one of the richest agricultural states of India. The only changes that were brought in by the British was in place of manual sluices, they have mechanical sluices. Otherwise, it's the same canals that are being used. The topography of the region through which the river Kaveri winds its way, the two monsoons, the southwest and the northeast, that affect different parts of the lengthy Kaveri, the slope of the land in the deltaic area, the texture of the soil, made all this possible. And the Chola genius lay in recognizing what seemed to be disparate and unrelated items, harnessing them and making them work together in harmony. Let me turn to the extraordinary Chola passion for jewelry, ornaments that were created solely to adorn the sacred bronzes, regardless of the fact that the images are created decked with jewels in bronze. All jewelry was made of gold. Most were further studded with a variety of gems. And Chola inscriptions give us astonishing details of each item of jewelry created to adorn the bronze festival images. And entire sets of jewelry were given to adorn these images from head to toe. By the way, none of the jewelry you're looking at is Chola. There is nothing from that period. But you notice the details that that master of Tiruvangadu indulged in. The hooks and the clasps in the rear view of the bronze that you see on the lower right, the back of the neck, that necklace, and these hooks and clasps that you see in the bronzes are also mentioned in the inscriptions as well. How important could this be? But the artist was a perfectionist. I'm going to cite this evening just 2 examples from dozens of inscriptions in the Tanjavur temple to illustrate the magnitude of such gifts. Rajaraja's queen, Panchavan Mahadevi, presented to the temple an image of Shiva. She called it in her inscription Tanjayarahar, the beautiful lord of Tanjavur. And she tells us that Shiva was accompanied by his consort Uma, and that the 2 images stood upon individual lotus bases, and that they were then placed upon a common rectangular pedestal. These are not those images, but they would have been similar to the images that I'm showing you here. In the year 1014, the queen made a lavish gift of several items of gold jewelry. They're strung with over 10,000 pearls to adorn both Shiva and his consort. 21 items of jewelry, the deeper color, are given to Shiva, and those are strung with a little over 8,000 pearls. And Uma's 10 ornaments included 1,909 pearls, as you can sort of see in these very sharply abbreviated lists. The inscription itself goes into extraordinary detail. And I'll show you one more inscription from the dozens of such inscriptional records of jewelry being gifted to the bronzes. The record I'm giving you is of a sacred armlet given by Rajaraja's elder sister Kundavai. And she tells us that it was not just a plain gold armlet like the one I have on the far right. It would have been more like the parakeet pendant, which has got all these gemstones in it. Note the details that are given. It's not enough to just say 441 diamonds. It's 20 pure diamonds, 406 diamonds with smooth edges, 5 flat ones with smooth edges, 10 square diamonds. Same thing with the rubies, halahalam of superior quality, then plain halahalam, smooth rubies, bluish rubies, unpolished rubies, and you go on, and the same thing with the pearls. Round pearls, roundish pearls, polished pearls, small pearls. It just goes on giving. The inscriptions are quite amazing. And then you can consider this pearl crown. Currently in a temple treasury, it's actually in a Pandya temple, and it's a Pandya donation, intended for the goddess when she chose to style her hair in a knot on one side of her head, so that crown had to accommodate that. Pearls lead me to address the Chola obsession with Sri Lanka. One major reason for this obsession, there are many others, was the Chola passion for pearls to adorn their sacred temple bronzes, and the need, therefore, to obtain access to the pearl fisheries of the Gulf of Mannar, or direct control, preferably, of the pearl fisheries in the Gulf of Mannar that lies between South India, the Pandya territory, and Sri Lanka. The waters of the Gulf of Mannar sustained major pearl oyster fisheries that yielded all manner of pearls, from tiny seed pearls to those the size of a green pea. They were known as early as the 1st century to Roman historian Pliny, who wrote his natural history, They were known to this unknown Greek sailor who authored a logbook, again in the 1st century, known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. It goes on. Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Fa Xian traveled to Sri Lanka in the mid-5th century, and he spoke of its pearls. And so too the 13th century Venetian traveler Marco Polo. The southwest monsoon, arriving along the west coast of India in early June, annually swept the oyster beds that lay along the Pandya coast of India towards Sri Lanka, where they settled at the mouth of the Aruvi River at Mannar, where they were relatively free from the danger of ocean currents. And then you have the northeast return monsoon currents of end December, early January, which dislodged some of the oyster beds, moving some of them back towards India and the Pandyan coastline. And it was in these shallow waters that divers dived for pearls. One can consider just one inscription that speaks of a gold Veerapattam, a forehead band of victory, given by Raja to an image of God Shiva, a bronze image of God Shiva. It contained 13,328 pearls, and then they list the pearls. If I have included some in the original language, it's because we don't know exactly what those pearls were. Round pearls, roundish pearls, polished pearls, small pearls, nimbulam, paitam, ambumudu, crude pearls, twin pearls, sapati, sakatu, pearls of brilliant water, pearls of red water. And we should remind ourselves that apart from the sacred bronzes, vast quantities of pearls were sent as gifts with the Chola embassies that went to China. And may one not assume that the kings and their queens and other members of the royal family themselves wore pearls? The desire, therefore, to control the pearl oyster fisheries of the Gulf of Mannar is an overlooked reason, and one substantial reason, there are others, for the Chola fixation on Sri Lanka. In conclusion, let me move briefly to temple inscriptions and the experience of walking around the exterior of an early Chola temple. One is made intensely aware of the fact that inscriptions cover all available spaces, including the various levels of base moldings. They flow seamlessly across the light projections and recesses of the temple walls. They flow around niches that contain images. Here's yet another one of those. They are even inscribed along trellis windows. These records comprise a massive readable archive. They provide us with a treasure trove of material that sheds light on multiple aspects of the time, from socio-political circumstances through the economics of agriculture, irrigation, to trade, to the religious milieu within which the temples function, and also almost incidentally to temple bronzes. In the midst of these varied details, we hear of several fascinating semi-judicial issues related to temple management. Here's one such example. It concerns the misbehavior of two Tamil priests, temple priests, bhattars, at the Shivapuram temple. Their list of misdemeanors commenced with taking a pearl necklace of the goddess Uma and giving it to a concubine, and then there's the list of their other misdemeanors. The temple priests, the Sri Maheshwaras, met with the town residents, the Urar, and they pronounced the two priests guilty of a crime both against God Shiva, so Shiva Droha, and against the king, Raja Droha. And they were sentenced to excommunication. And their property, they're using judicial terms here, both movable and immovable, including servants, was handed over to the state. I give you one more interesting and intriguing temple inscription from the temple of Achyutamangalam. It dated to the year 1207, and it gives expression to a principle that we classify in the US anyway as eminent domain, whereby a city or a state is entitled to take over privately owned property for necessary common interest purposes. So this inscription records an agreement made by the Somnath Deva temple that had the sanction of the Chola king at that time, Kulottunga III. And it was agreed that the street in front of the temple was not wide enough anymore to accommodate the grand processions of bronze deities being conducted by the temple. And so the authorities were empowered to demolish the houses on one side of the street fronting the temple in order to widen the street. And the inscription goes on to tell us that these authorities were now required to make adequate repairs and alterations to provide proper alternate housing for the dispossessed house owners. One of these days, we may be fortunate enough to have a complete inventory of Chola inscriptions, but none such exists today, even though there are somewhere in the region of 13,000 Chola inscriptions over that 4.5 centuries of the Chola period. Only the inscriptions on Rajaraja Chola's great temple, the Brihadishwara at Tanjavur, have been published fully together with an English translation. And what I've uncovered for this book is just the proverbial tip of that iceberg. The most exciting, but also the most frustrating issue for me, writing after 5 decades in the field, is that this inscriptional material is in full view and plain sight for anyone walking around an early Chola temple. Many can read parts of it, although the way in which they are to be read is sometimes quite complicated. So I end where I started. The Tamil corpus of Shiva sacred hymns, 700 in number, the Tevaram, commences with the 300 hymns of child saint Sambandar, who lived in the late 600s, in the 7th century. His very first hymn speaks of Shiva as the thief who stole my heart, the title I chose for the book. This phrase, the thief who stole my heart, is the refrain of each verse of this first hymn. And it's very first verse, and therefore the very first verse of the entire Tevaram collection describes Shiva wearing a ear ornament, calls him the bull rider, describes the crescent moon in his locks, speaks of the sacred ash on his body, and calls him the thief who stole my heart. Here it is in the original. Todudaya Sheviyan, Vidayeri, or tu Venmadi Shudi, Kadudaya Shudalai Podi Pushi, Yen Ullam Kavar Kalvan. If you wonder about my Tamil, it's because I'm a Tambram myself. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that amazing talk, and it was really wonderful and really went back in time with that. I have 2 questions, and please forgive my ignorance, but I'm also trying to understand the technical background of the skills that are required to produce bronzes at this time, because in my mind, in the back of my mind, there was this refrain saying, Donatello's David is the first freestanding bronze that the Western world has. Are these freestanding bronzes? And they are much earlier than that. So I just wanted to ask about that. And the second is the contrapposto kind of posture of these bronzes. Where is that coming? What is the influence behind that?
Yes, these are definitely very much earlier than any Renaissance or Western bronzes of that period. On the other hand, the Roman and Greek bronzes are much earlier than this. And India itself has bronzes before this. It's just that in Tamil Nadu, it suddenly erupts at about this phase. You know, you've got Buddhist bronzes, which have been created earlier. the method of producing them is known, and there is copper in northern India. But the sudden outburst of huge numbers of bronzes and changing the face of the images that are being taken in procession happens at the start of the Chola period. Does that answer the first half? Now I've forgotten what was the second question. Oh, the Tribanga. Where does that come from? That's a difficult question. It's there in all stone sculpture of an earlier period. You can look at, images on temples, whether that's in Orissa or it's in, why the Tribanga? It's an extremely graceful pose. It's also one in which, if you stand with your weight on one foot, it automatically creates, I'm not in Tribanga, but it's easy to see that one hip goes out. And it's sort of such a graceful pose. So where it came from, why exactly? Is it connected to yoga? There is the yogic twist that you're supposed to do. It's quite possible. There's all sorts of ideas about that. Yoga postures and yoga performers would have been those who are taking these various twisted poses in yoga. You know the twisted poses. It could have been partly that as well. We don't really know what it is, but it became sort of a typical Indian thing from very early on. So it's not uniquely Chola, it's just that there are some absolutely exquisite. It's also interesting, God Vishnu is never, he's in Samabhanga, stand straight. It is Shiva and Uma and Lakshmi who go into Tribanga.
Dr. Dehejia, to your left.
Hi. My simple question is, can we do something to get this 257 pound from Cleveland Museum of Art? Our Shiva as a wondrous dancer.
Are you talking about trying to repatriate the image? When you think about the number of images that were produced during the Chola period, can we not afford to let a few images be in museums outside the country where they are admired in the way in which we are not able to display them even? The other thing is, most of you may not know this, but because I spent so much time in the Chola country, because of the fact that there has been smuggling, the HRMCE, which is the Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowments Department of the Tamil Nadu government, which looks after something like 28,000 temples, modern and ancient, in Tamil Nadu, has taken all Chola bronzes away from the temples in which they were, and they put them into these icon centers. And these icon centers are huge, large, concrete buildings. They have no windows. They have, of course, no air conditioning, and one single door in front. The temple priests that I was talking to are weeping because they say we can no longer, these small, beautiful Chola temples, not the very major ones which have Vijayanagar period bronzes in them. They weep and they say, we can't do our festivals. And the Chola inscriptions show us that there were something like 36 festivals that were celebrated with bronzes, of which 3 were multi-day, the main ones which went outside the temple. And these priests tell me that, we used to be able to have this sense of community. The community came together around these festivals. We cooked all this food, it was distributed, we took them in festival, in processions. And all of that is gone. So in a way, the fear of losing the bronzes has inadvertently created a situation in which the temples no longer have the bronzes. So the worshippers can't see them. Of course, the worshippers are not interested in the beauty of the form. They want Shiva, so they can't worship those images. And no art lover can see them in the temple or in any other place, because these icon centers have sort of got these bronzes locked away. You've got to get 3 people to bring their keys and unlock them, and they won't unlock them for anybody. Or I had to work so hard at it for 3 years before I got access to one of them, and only because N. Ravi, who runs the Hindu, managed somehow to get me in there. There are multiple ones of these. Now here's the other big problem that worries me immensely. Bronzes are subject under certain conditions to bronze disease. I've seen some bronzes at the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C., Egyptian bronzes, where you can't tell whether it's an animal, a creature, what is it, because of this green bronze disease that comes onto bronzes. It sort of starts out and starts becoming powdery, and then it just disintegrates. The only way to stop disintegration, and this comes from the head of the Freer lab, is air and water. And that's what our Chola bronzes were intended for. They were intended to be carried in procession outside, and then they were intended to be lustrated with everything from milk and honey and everything, but also water. And it's just air and water that keeps them okay. So that's another disadvantage. I'm sorry, I didn't answer your question about exactly, but I think you can see where I'm coming from. Okay.
Thank you for a very engrossing presentation. Obviously, you're an expert in this field. I am fascinated by Chola bronzes. And I know that Cholas ruled Sri Lanka. So they were conquerors. If you go to the big temple, the main archways are celebrating war and victory. So I think that played a big role in their ability to get material, and even experts to come and do work for them. Copper has been used in vessels and various ritualistic items in India for centuries before the Cholas. So copper was very much there.
In North India.
Yeah, but they were travelers. They went up to Cambodia, as people were mentioning. So I think that part is, in my opinion, not a big deal. The second thing is this Tribhanga is very much there in the Indian scriptures. It is a very big part of our describing the iconography of deities. Rama and Krishna images, I have seen bronzes in Tribhanga. So Vishnu may not be, in that pose, but there are. I want to ask you one question. There seems to have been a technological breakthrough that enabled this quality of bronzes to come up around the 10th century. Thirugnana Sambandar went to Trincomalee in 7th century. His poetry mentions that. But this breakthrough happened. Can you give me some insight? What was the technological breakthrough that made them produce this one-of-a-kind piece, each one, so perfect?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I can only observe it and marvel at the perfection. What was a technological breakthrough is very difficult to know, because after all, there were Buddhist bronzes much earlier, but much smaller. The scale and size and the perfection and the beauty, and it's easy to say, for me to say, there's this religious fervor that sort of inspired them. But it still doesn't answer the question of the technological advance, really. So it's one of those things that for the moment still is awaiting an answer. Yeah.
I was fascinated by your book that I read a little over a year ago, and I found it to be as fascinating as your lecture. My question was going to be about bronze disease, but you already answered that part of the question. But in your book, you made a reference to this green patina that, if I remember your book correctly, you made a reference to this green hue that covers the bronzes, and you asked why some of them are green hue and why some of them are darker. Could you explain what that means?
Yes. So the green patina, which is what maybe museums prefer and admire, and it has built up because of being buried. So any image which has this green patina is something that has been uncovered from underground. And there was this period in the 13th century where the Tamil Nadu temples buried their bronzes because they were afraid of the armies of the Sultanate coming down south, and they were afraid that the images might be damaged, might be taken away. The armies of the Sultanate did come. What they were interested in was the jewels, so the gold and the gems was what they took away. But the Tamil temples had already buried most of their bronzes. And this happened in temple after temple after temple. You've seen so many green bronzes, mostly in museums. They are all buried bronzes. One assumes that the idea was, and the burial spot is known only to a very few people. It would have been, like a state secret. Where did we bury the bronzes? The idea would have been that once the Sultanate armies go away north, we will take them out, reconsecrate them, put them into the temple. But the Sultanate armies didn't go away. They established a sultanate in Madurai called the Malabar Sultanate. And so these bronzes remained underground. Presumably, the people who buried them and knew where the secret hiding place was, died without passing on the image. In some cases, we've got actual inscriptions which say we took out the buried bronze, we reconsecrated it, and it's in worship. But in many, many cases, so starting in the 1900s, as the Tamil Nadu temples started expanding and adding an extra hall and a granary and a kitchen and all these things, as they dug in the temple premises or just outside, they found these bronzes. This Tiruvangadu hoard is part of it's a completely buried hoard that was uncovered, and most of these museum bronzes are those that were buried and came to light because of construction work that was happening around it. You might have noticed that when I showed you the marriage group, that the Lakshmi was bright, different color. That's because, for some reason, she didn't get buried, and she remained in the temple outside with air and things, and so she didn't acquire that patina which comes from burying it and the moisture and being underground. If that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dehejia, for this wonderful lecture. I have a question regarding the faces and their features. I was wondering if it followed the almond eyes, the sharp noses, a stylistic convention for the time, and if there was a story or a source for that convention.
Well, here's one thing. Most of the sources that we have, the Shastras, the Shilpa Shastras, are slightly later compilations, which must have taken the actual bronze workshops themselves of that period, must have evolved a set of proportions, which then was codified and put into a text. So most of the texts are a little later as compilations. So the miracle of the actual workshops is something that we have no information about. much as we, and 13,000 inscriptions, you would think there would be something. But no, they weren't interested in that. I mean, that's what we are interested in. Those people who are writing the inscriptions are much more interested in who paid for it, what money was given, what are the boundaries of the land that was given. So they give you every, tree and stream and rocks and everything. They describe all that, but they don't tell us about the artistic things. So we are left with later compilations from which to judge backwards.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dehejia. I was curious about the role of women. Are there any women featured in the inscriptions? Were they involved with the making of the art?
Making the art, we have found nothing about women. Donations, yes. A lot of donations. I'm just working on a piece which I've titled, tentative title, it's not yet published, but it's hinted at in my book, where taking the goddess's daughter, the women give largely images of Uma. They let somebody else give the image of Shiva. It has to be Shiva and Uma, but they don't give the Shiva image, they give the image of Uma. And they say, taking her as my daughter, I celebrated her marriage. So there's this marriage festival that you see them. And yen mahalar kondu is the phrase that they're using. Literally, taking her as my daughter, I have given this image and I'm celebrating her marriage. When you come to the images of the jewelry, same thing happens. Kundavai, Rajaraja's elder sister, gives only to the images of Uma. So her brother, Rajaraja, has given Shiva and Uma images. She is now giving jewelry, but only to Uma, ignoring the Shiva. I presume she said, her brother, you go ahead and give that. I'm giving only for Uma. And she gives images also, bronzes, only of Uma. So there's a tendency there's lots of women's donations. Tendency is to go for the goddess there. We've also got a number of inscriptions of these queens, which show that they are, it's a family project. And Rajaraja has built this great temple in Tanjavur, and there are 66 bronzes given by members of his family, also highly placed officials. But the members of the family very often include women. So, but in production, no. On the other hand, I'll give you a modern story, not of South India, of Nathdwara painters, where a scholar spent time in the houses of these Nathdwara painters. And she found that very often it was the women who painted it. It was rolled underneath the charpai, underneath the bed. And when it was ready, the men put their name on it. So we don't know.
Thank you, Professor Dehejia. That was an excellent talk. I just wanted to add something which my friend here talked about in terms of the effulgence of these images and the sizes. And the relation that I had was with respect to Chinese bronzes, that when the Chinese started making these massive bronzes, the biggest problem there seemed to be the uneven cooling of the bronze, which would cause them to crack. And the addition of phosphorus seemed to actually, overcome that technical issue. But the part of it is that, depending on what the size of the bronze is, as it cools, depending on whether you've got an arm that can radiate heat and cool down faster, and you have a torso that actually has a lot, the torso is susceptible to crack. So I think that somewhere probably in the early 9th century, they did tackle this problem of moving from smaller bronzes to larger bronzes without it actually getting physically damaged in the manufacturing process. So I don't know, do you have any research on that, sir, ma'am?
No, I haven't come across very much. Of course, we all know that tin is absolutely essential. Without tin, there's another little twist on tin, because the prime sources in the world are in Malaysia. And that, in fact, there's yes, it's a TV series called From the Fiery Furnace. And it traces the fact of that even in Neolithic times in Europe, where they have bronzes, they only saw there's no tin anywhere there, and that it's in Malaysia. And they're suggesting that in Neolithic period, that there was a lot of movement of people, and that we think we are the only people who move around the world, but that there always was this movement, and that tin from Malaysia had to have reached Europe to be able to produce bronzes, because without the tin, it doesn't work. Very little, very little. Even for the Chola period, it was probably from Malaysia. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask that in the pictures you showed us, that even the queen and the women and the goddesses, they are all shirtless. So when exactly did the women of India start adopting the idea of having to wear something on top?
That's a pretty difficult question. I'm not sure I can give you a clear answer, but let's look at it. When you look at bronzes is a little different. When you look at temple sculptures, say take Khajuraho, when you look at those sculptures, they've all got clothing. But what they've done is they've moved all the folds of the drapery are on the side. So you know that there was drapery, but they have taken, I think it's a artistic license in many cases. But you have also got a point in what you say, because you can come back to Kerala when the British came in, and Kerala where no women were not supposed to cover their bodies, upper bodies. It's one of those questions for which I don't think there's a simple answer, or a single answer even, that in each region the answer has to be slightly different. And finally, we probably have to say we don't know.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. My question originally was about why Lakshmi was in a different color in that marriage group, which you have answered already, which is leading to the next question. If Lakshmi was not buried and the others were buried, how would you identify, first of all, that she belongs to the same group or the same artist made her? Even Vishnu, though he had patina similar to Shiva and Parvati, stylistically he looked very different. So how would you recognize them as belonging to one group or the
actually,
artist?
in this case, they actually fit together. Those hands just fit exactly, and the positioning in this particular case. The Vishnu, I think part of it is because he's standing straight and always is in Samabhanga and doesn't have the Tribhanga or the what shall we call it, the sensuous nature is of Shiva and Uma and also of Lakshmi, but not of Vishnu, who is majestic, but he's not the thief who stole your heart. It's the other bronzes. In most cases, you can gauge it from just putting them together and looking at them side by side. Sometimes we have to do it with photographs if things are widely separated.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dehejia. The question I want to ask is that you said that, in the 13th century when the sultans attacked from the north, they kind of buried all of these idols around the temple or wherever, we don't know. But I was reading, and apparently there was a lot of war between the Cholas and the Chalukyas. from the 7th century up till I think the 10th, 11th century. When all of this was happening, all of this was, I'm sure that they were also trying to attack the temples and everything. But was this something that they were doing even back then? Like over these 4 centuries, that we have to kind of hide our idols, or they were not doing it back then, only did it in the 13th century?
The burial of the bronzes is at that period because they are portable. You can pick them up. When you have large stone images, you literally have to take them off from the temple walls, which is a bit more difficult. And of course, the Pallavas were fighting the Chalukyas were fighting the Rashtrakutas were fighting. There was all this battling going on. And it is capturing a major image of another dynasty. A Hindu to Hindu dynasty was as important for the ruler. The Muslim armies came for the jewels and the wealth. There's almost nothing in any of their texts about an image. They're not interested in the image. Forget it. They want the jewels that they're looking for. So it's quite a complex situation. There's one famous image that one of the later Chola emperors brought from the Kalyani Chalukyas. And we know it because, one, it's in Tanjavur, and secondly, he put an inscription on it saying, I destroyed and burnt the capital and brought this here as my proof. So every now and again, there are images which are completely out of place. But it's not always this way. We've got a Pala period dancing Shiva, which is very different. The dance pose is very different. And it's in one of the Tamil temples. And at a certain stage, we find that the gurus of the rulers came from Bengal. So it's possible that that was brought by one of the rulers. It's a very complex situation. It's a fascinating one too. But yes, capturing the power that resides in an image that is sacred to another dynasty, and you've defeated them and you bring that image. We've got lots of images like that. Vijayanagar period also. There's famous Ganeshas which came from here to there. There's the Vatapi Ganesha, which is Badami, which is celebrated in song in Tamil songs. But there wasn't burial at that time because I think this whole portable images got buried. Yep.
Hi, Dr. Dehejia. I just wanted to, it's just something that I saw in the list of names of the ones who commissioned the works. There was one Turukka. So I just wanted to ask you whether that refers to perhaps a Turkish trader, traveler. Do we have non-locals commissioning these works? The Turukka sort of struck me.
No, we don't have any specific evidence of that. The commissioning of bronzes is very rare to find any specific information, only the few and far between. Mostly you find donative inscriptions which are giving coconut groves, or they're giving palm trees, or they're giving gardens, or they're giving flowers, or they're giving chennare, beautiful clothing to clothe the bronzes. Very rare to find an actual donation of a specific bronze image. There are a few, but most of our 13,000 inscriptions, that's why I said that incidentally and occasionally we find references to the actual bronzes. Most of the time it's land, gold. The most popular donation in the early Chola period was for lamps. So your lamps to light the temples. And together with the lamp, the most popular donation was to give 90 goats or 30 cows which were entrusted to certain shepherds, given to them, provided they provided daily so much ghee for burning the lamps. And there are these perpetual lamps, lamps that have to stay lit day and night in order to light the temples. And that's almost half of the donations in any single temple are for these lamps.
So you mentioned that there was no mention of the master, and that made me wonder if were there more than one masters, or such school of art, or an influence, and yet I'm propelled to ask this question, though you partly already answered that, which is you don't know. So, which made me even curious. What would be your hypothesis about they not making a mention?
That question, of course, can be extended across the field of Indian art. You can look at the Khajuraho temples. There's not a single mention of an actual sculptor. Or you can look at the temples in Orissa. Sculptors' names are few and far between. And Belur and Halebeed is one of those exceptions where you do find names of sculptors. Most of the rest of India, there's no mention. So why is it not mentioned? Was it not supposed to be that you didn't take credit? You didn't put your name out there? It's an interesting question. Why did they not sign? In places where you could sign, let's say that the bronze doesn't, where do you sign? You could put it on the pedestal, but they're not doing it. That's a question that applies so widely across Indian art that we someday may come up with an answer.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I noticed a detail on Uma. She was wearing a sacred thread.
Yes, it's interesting.
It's very interesting. Could you tell us some more about
I don't know why, but Uma does occasionally have that sacred thread. Was it something that women also wore in ancient times, and it then became an upanayanam for men only, as it is today? It's a very intriguing question. Here again, I've got to admit that you've asked a question which is worth following up, but I don't know how we follow it up. Truly.
Men and women had upanayanam.
Hmm?
Try to find the deities wearing the holy thread. The male and the female deities. It's always been for both. Especially if you talk to other samajas, they will tell you both the men and women have the threads have.
Possibly.
Good evening. So yeah, I guess my question is that, okay, I know that there's a regrettable lack of in regards to a lot of Indian history, there's a lack of textual evidence often. But I'm still really curious, do we have any biographical detail, not even precise detail, just a general idea of how the work of crafting these statues, was it some kind of family tradition? Was it how were they working? Did they have workshops? In Renaissance Italy, there were big workshops, and there were masters and apprentices, and it was sort of proto-industrial thing. So do we have any idea how production actually happened, and some kind of details about the life of the people who were doing these things?
We can look at the masters who still exist today, maybe, in Swami Malai, which is the place where bronze casting is very active. And there, one of the best of the workshops, the most magnificent workshops, is run by three brothers. And their father was the master craftsman, master artist. And then the three brothers, two of them make images, one of them manages the whole thing. And they say that we come from a family of master sculptors, always. One assumes that there were workshops and that there were sort of guilds and that sort of thing. It's just that for some reason the emphasis in the ancient texts is more on the sacred part of it and not on the people who created the sacred. So it's like the human element has been sort of left out of all of this. It's just not there, but it has to be. I mean, in the case of the Renaissance, we know we've got there are always the names of everybody. And here the names are very little, and we know very little. We didn't keep records of that sort, which is another question, why did we not think it was important to keep such records? There.
I noticed that most of the features of all the Chola bronzes and a lot of Indian statues have oriental features, like even these, and why would that be? Is it because it's from a template, or even some of the headgears are like kind of like what we see in Indonesia or Balinese?
The features I can't comment on, I don't see it. The ornamentation, yes, it's a period ornamentation. And every god or every monarch or every queen, they have a certain type of headdress which is repeated. Remember that you're sort of producing images for vast numbers of temples. There is a period style, in the 10th century, they favored this sort of headdress and this sort of pattam, forehead band, and so on. Oriental features I don't see, because it depends what you mean by Oriental also. Yeah?
Hello, hello, ma'am. So that was a very insightful presentation. So my question is about closer. Oh. So that was my question is about the formation, the oxidization of the statue over the years, the formation of the green patina. So, but when I saw the statue of Skanda, I see a blue patina, and here it's a green patina. So it's not. I realized that it's not just the result of burying, it's also the result of composition of the alloys that has gone into the formation of the statues. So
your observation is correct, but it's I don't know how to use the correct ways. No, that threesome is actually green. It's just that I don't know how to use the technique to match them up.
But the color visually seeing, it's slightly bluish green, right? So was there the composition of, when it comes to making of certain deities, was the composition really a matter of making certain types of deities those times?
I don't think so. We took samples from 5 bronzes. It took me about 5 years to get permission to take a tiny little sample from the bottom of the bronze, which is not even going to be touching the bronze, almost. So it's very, very difficult to get permission to take a tiny sample in order to. They've now developed some techniques in Denmark and places like that where you don't have to have that much. And it's the tiniest sample is all that's required. But they're now developing techniques where you don't even need to do that, and you can, very expensive equipment and all of that. And it hasn't been applied as yet to Indian bronzes. But most of them are, if you go into the Tanjavur Art Gallery and you walk through, you will see, because those are bronzes that haven't been cleaned. By the way, once I should have put in one or two of the old bronzes that have been cleaned by the temple itself, because the temple recovered it from the temple tank, and they scrubbed it down in order to get it back to a coppery shine. And it's quite startling, because the first time I went into this particular temple, I just walked past the image, thinking it was a modern image. And then I did the double take, and I said, my God, this is the image I came to see. What have they done to it? And of course, they're not using any chemicals there, but they've got this bundi kote, the olive, the palm olive of the palm tree from which Colgate palm olive took its name, is all that they do, and you put that into a little bowl of water and it suds up if you leave it for a few minutes, and then they use that, seed and husk and all, to clean the bronzes. And you can get the bronzes back even after a lot of burial. Museums prefer them to look this way, so the museums don't do it, but temples do it. But it's an interesting thought.
I have a question about the international trade of bronzes. I mean, we all know how the international trade of bronzes. We all know how Lansdane had the Tiruvarur Shiva bronze copied, and how Dr. Nagaswamy brought it back, Director of Archaeology. Could you tell us something about how all this happened?
So bronzes have been smuggled. Now the smuggling of bronzes has stopped because of the attention that's been brought to it. The bronzes are smuggled because the temple authorities are involved in it. You can't get anywhere without the temple authority. Then you've got to get a local someone who will transport it, take it to a dealer maybe in Delhi. This is not happening anymore, but it was in Bombay or Delhi where it goes. That dealer then doubles the price. And then finally that dealer or an agent of the dealer sort of sells it to a museum. Until the recent attention on that, it wasn't considered wrong. Around the world, every museum would be empty. Take any national museum, whether it's the Metropolitan in New York or the British Museum in London, they would have to return every one of the objects that they have, from any other country, because it's, you would literally have to be restricted to only your own country objects because they belong in the country and they're still there. So, you can't have pre-Columbian, you can't have China, you can't have Japan, you can't have India, you can't have Greece, you can't have Rome, It's one of those major conundrums on how to handle this. And one of the things, of course, is to let things that are already there, purchased and acquired at a time when there were no rules, where even the people in India weren't sort of all het up about it until it became a huge thing. And those were bought in days when these rulings hadn't come in, when the UNESCO regulations that people signed hadn't yet come in. And it seems to me that if you allow that, and then you now have rules that nobody is going to buy. The other problem is that sending things back, the bronzes so the famous case with the Nagaswamy bronze, the judge of the London High Court ruled in favor of India, but what he said was that the bronze belongs to the Shiva Linga of that temple. And he declared the Shiva Linga of that temple a judicial entity who could own. And he also said that it had to go back to that temple. It never went back to that temple, it went into one of the icon centers. Every one of the bronzes that has come back Norton Simon, you can quote any bronze. They've all gone into icon centers. They haven't gone either into a museum or into the temple to which they might have once belonged. Shivapuram, we know it was a Shivapuram Nataraja, but it's in some sort of icon center. So I'm not sure that what the correct answer is, but to me it feels that things acquired in a day and age when it wasn't illegal or it wasn't considered wrong, all the major collections of world museums would have to be emptied out. So I think restricting it in future as opposed to asking for things back. This is my own personal feeling on it.
But when you have the men in bronzes,
and look, there's
an entire people who believe their ancestor spirits are in those bronzes.
And you know what's happened to them? There's a fight as to who it belongs to, and now it might as well have stayed where it was because it's nowhere displayed or nowhere anything. And there are pieces that have come back, and I know that at least one member of the audience here can testify to that. A piece from Nagarjunakonda from a museum in New York was returned. It was a small fragment. And Nagarjunakonda has got a whole room full of wonderful, full sculptures that they're not even able to display. It's a sort of a go down, it's a shed out. And we walk through it and the curator says to us, what am I going to do with this little piece? I've locked it up in my safe because it's supposed to have come back from New York. But what am I going to do to look at all that I've got, which I can't display? So, I mean, there's a whole lot of issues, very complex issues. There's no easy solution to this whole problem. Hold on a minute, nobody else will be able to hear you.
It's slightly unrelated, but I wanted to ask, there's a lot of mention of pearls even through your presentation. Were they valued more over jewels back then? And also that brings me to my next question, which is the significance of coinage in the Chola Empire.
What about the coinage?
The significance of the coinage in Chola Empire. Like how significant was coinage there? Was it like the dealings were happening through pearls or rice? Because you also mentioned everything's dealt with rice.
So we have lots of inscriptions which talk about goods in the market. And the markets are named often, at Tanjavur, the market is named after the queen. Tribhuvana Devi, Mahadevi market, it's called. So it's named like that. And in some of those inscriptions, you're told that so many measures of rice is what you have to give in order to get so much of oil or so much of things. So they're using rice as a measure. Very interesting. All the employees of the Tanjavur temple are all paid in so many measures of rice per year, not in coinage. So coinage is important. It's royal, and it's probably the most. It's the 5,000 rupee note, not the daily 10 rupee, 15 rupee, which the rulers are using and which are more significant. Seems to be more that way, but it's an interesting question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vidya Dehejia, for this profound and inspiring immersion into the world of incandescent beauty of the Chola bronzes. Thank you so much.
May I say thank you to my audience too for being attentive and asking so many questions.
Thank you all for coming, and good night.